Sequels in 2024 are everywhere. From book series, movies, games, almost everyone is turning any IP they can into a franchise to shovel more coals into the content machine. And it makes sense. It's a tried and true method to make sales for the company and please shareholders. But indie games don't have shareholders, and are usually a small team working on passion projects. Heck, a majority of indie projects nowadays are crowdfunded, so why do indie devs decide to make sequels to their games? Is it a wholehearted attempt to bring all the ideas, mechanics, and themes of their first game into a more polished new experience? Or will they just forego the ideas of the first game and make a brand new experience for a newer audience? Or maybe they just felt they had more stories to tell in the world they made. Regardless of their reasoning, there's no denying there's more competition now more than ever due to how easy it is to get started making games. And getting your new 2D platformer to stand out amongst the over 1,500 2D platformers that came out in 2023 alone is an extremely difficult thing to do. So when a dev gets the attention on their game where thousands of people are playing and talking about it, they can use the profit for their studio to continue creating the games they want to create. And it makes sense to create a sequel to a game that found success, because it's now an established IP with a fan base. But when you look at indie game sequels, their numbers are drastically lower than the first games in reviews and sales. So why is that? Let's start by looking at one of my favorite indie games of all time.
Ruin has come to our family.
Darkest Dungeon sets you down the dark path to delve into the depths of an estate that dug greedily into the earth, unleashing eldritch horrors upon the lands. You take on the role of a party of 4 adventurers, where you delve into the dungeons, find loot to repair the town, and fight back the evils that have been unleashed here. In doing so, you have to manage your hero's stress, health, equipment, skills, and so forth. While the game is a roguelite, it has a lengthy RPG-like campaign, where throughout your adventures you grow attached to your heroes, so when they inevitably fall in combat, it can be truly difficult to keep going. This type of design is very much against the norm, and it asks a lot of the player. But that's where it became successful. In the same way that Dark Souls targeted a specific type of player, Darkest Dungeon found its community and they sold the game simply by sharing their experience with them. So then came 2021.
Ruin has found you at last.
Darkest Dungeon 2 was coming. It had been a while since the first game had come out, and I was hoping for another long campaign to get stressed out and die a lot in. But after it came out into early access, I pretty quickly found myself getting bored with the gameplay loop. Instead of creating your own story through your adventures with your heroes, the heroes are their own characters with their own stories that you learn through altars of knowledge. And instead of doing a lot of the things that made the first game special, they just normalized it into making it a generic roguelite experience. I mean, how many times have you seen this level design for roguelites? With the more roguelike design of Darkest Dungeon 2, you lost the dread you would feel in the first game with the stressed characters about to be on death's door, and having to weigh the options of continuing and risking your heroes, or leaving and having to heal and recover them. These are subjects that the devs themselves talked about at GDC one year.
You should do well, but every once in a while, things go badly. And we want to put you in that uncomfortable space of, I should be winning right now, this is getting away from me, do I run? Do I abandon? Do I change my plan? Or do I hang in here and push through? And there's a couple, this can go a variety of different ways. Maybe you make that gut check and you hang in there and you win, and that should be a moment that you love the game. You should also applaud yourself for having the self-control to retreat and go back to town and lick your wounds. And I think that it's hard to communicate that, and that's why we put that first screen up when I showed you, like, Darkest Dungeon is about making the most of a bad situation. We're conditioned to play where you expect success, especially in the last few years with mobile games and things. You expect success, and it's really just a matter of solving the problem to get there. And if you don't have success, you reload and try again until you get there. And we fundamentally wanted to change that. And sometimes I think it's hard to communicate that to players, that they'll buy the game and then this will happen. It's just like, what have I gotten into? And
those changes to the game, as well as the unlocking items that you can then later find in runs, just makes it feel like a bunch of other games I've played before with a Darkest Dungeon skin over it. And I do want to say that I enjoyed Darkest Dungeon 2. Hell, I bought the game day one on Epic. But it's just not what I came to want from the first game. And I know I'm not alone in that. Just by looking at the reviews for the first and second game on Steam, Darkest Dungeon 1 has over 100,000 more reviews, and most of the negative reviews on Darkest Dungeon 2 are just people saying that it's a good game, it's just not the direction they were hoping Red Hook Studios would go. I never want creatives to feel locked into making a product they don't want to make just because it's what the fans want. But when designers talk about how sometimes you need to break the rules to make the games you want to make, it kind of feels bad as a fan to see them just follow the current trends of other roguelites.
And so one of the things that works really well in the game is just breaking some rules. The save one is the one I always come back to. The way I love to play games, I like permissive save systems. Who are you to tell me how I should and shouldn't save my game? But when we talked about Darkest Dungeon, we realized that would not work. It would rob the player of the experience that we intend them to have. And that was an interesting thing to be advocating and fighting for something that you don't even agree with normally. You agree with it for this game. And I think that's a really important point. You should never lose sight that you are designing for that game, not all games, or rules of thumb, or like, make sure you never do this. So, break the rules.
Without a doubt, Darkest Dungeon 2 was a success. It has more reviews on Steam than most indie games could ever dream of having. It has well over 500,000 units sold. But as a consumer and a fan, I just don't know if I needed it. Moving on from Darkest Dungeon 2 is a game I think did sequels in a way that I enjoy more. Risk of Rain is an indie title that probably doesn't need much of an introduction in 2024, but back in 2013 it was a smaller title founded by two devs who saw an extremely successful Kickstarter for their project Risk of Rain. The gameplay, for those who are not familiar, has you crash landing on a planet where hordes of enemies try and kill you. Your goal is to collect items and try and get back to the ship to launch off the planet and escape. As you play through the stages, the game gets more difficult the longer in the run you are, shown by the meter in the top right. Each stage has at least one boss that spawns when you start the teleporter. You then just need to kill all the enemies, and after the teleporter is charged up, you go to the next stage. That's it, it's a pretty simple game. And with the multiplayer, there's a lot of hours of content in this little roguelite, and that was it for a while. Until years later, the game got a sequel announced. Risk of Rain 2, a full new game turning it from a 2D action platformer to a third-person shooter. But what it did differently from Darkest Dungeon sequel is it kept all the systems that made it feel like the first game. They kept the stage-based level progression, the game continues to get harder the longer a run goes on, and you're still trying to escape the planet you crashed on. Me wording it like this might make it sound like it's more of the same from the first game, but with the change to 3D, it literally added a new dimension for the devs to work in, along with a bunch of new content they added as well. Now, neither Risk of Rain 2013 or Risk of Rain 2 are perfect games. The 2013 version required Hamachi! And Risk of Rain 2 has some unfortunate balancing issues, as well as one of the worst phases to a final boss I've ever played in a game. But the success the second game found from the first one is likely because of how they built upon the systems that worked for the game and what they wanted to create. Now, I would be remiss to not talk about Risk of Rain Returns, the remake of the first game that came out a few years after Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain Returns is a modern take on the first game. It was not meant to outperform or compete with Risk of Rain 2, but more to bring more quality to the first game for people who thought the 2013 version was a bit too dated. The game has all the content from the first game redesigned with new pixel art, as well as content from the second game that's been redesigned to fit the 2D platformer. I think that Hopo Games found a system to making sequels that worked for their view of what they want their game to be. By adding to existing systems that they had in games before, they added more game modes and new ways to play instead of changing the core gameplay loop itself. And even though they're no longer working on Risk of Rain 2 and left the future of DLC to Gearbox Software, I'm eagerly waiting to see what Hopo Games does next. What does that say? It's so small. What? I can't read it. Wait, enhance it? Enhance it? Whoa! Now, I can't sit here and talk about expectations for sequels in the indie game scene and not talk about being many people's gateway into indie games. Hollow Knight needs no introduction. Finding major Kickstarter success in 2014, Team Cherry was able to create an extremely polished and stylized Metroidvania. It was so many people's first time playing something like that a lot of 2D games that come out now are considered Hollow Knight clones by a loud minority of the fanbase. So I won't talk too much about the game, but rather about its upcoming sequel, Silksong. Originally being a stretch goal for a second playable character on their Kickstarter, Silksong has morphed into a whole new beast. and that beast has been a bit of a roller coaster for the fanbase. Being announced in February of 2019, there's not been much news from the devs since then. Minus the occasional quote or hyper-analyzed ESRB rating, it has led to an extremely obsessive community. And that's not something that's unique to this community. I mean, look at the Elden Ring DLC hype before the trailer was announced with the release date. But Silksong is something special, with there being a major YouTube channel whose entire identity is posting daily news content with thousands of views per video. And all this is just my way of pointing out that fans are passionate about things they like, and we've normalized that if something is successful, not even financially, but even if it's successful in the eyes of its creator, that it needs a sequel, that it needs a spin-off game, or it needs an extended universe of some kind that we can consume and talk about. But do we need them? Do we need a company or a creative to keep making things in a world we're already familiar with? Even though the numbers show that a lot of people don't even end up playing the sequels to games? Or when they do, a lot of reviews just say, it's good, just wish it was more like the first game, or compared to the first game, the sequel feels lacking, or the team focused on the wrong systems. So even though the original games do well, their sequels almost always get less reviews with worse reviews to boot. So who are these indie sequels for? First is the passionate consumers and fans who enjoyed the first game and felt they needed more, whether it's of the mechanics, story, world, or all of the above. Next is the developer themselves. It's easy as a creative when something you create does well to make more of that thing. You already have a lot of the systems and core ideas done, and you can even use the same design pillars, and look at that. You got the early stages of a design document already done. But that line of thinking is what leads to consumers feeling like the first game had more heart than the second game. Because for a lot of studios, that's all a sequel is more of the same from the first game, just with an added mechanic or a new combat feature. So what does this mean for you, the dev who's trying to make a sequel and wants it to sell as well as the first game? I don't fucking know. And neither does anyone else. The only thing you can do as a developer is look at what you did in the first game, see if it's what you want to continue doing, and minimize the risk where you can. After that, it's mainly just making a good product and marketing it well. Really all this video is a rant on how I wish more devs would think about why they're making a sequel to their game, instead of just, we should make one because the first one did good. And I don't mean to generalize either. There are plenty of companies and devs that don't give a shit about making a sequel to their game or making it a franchise. Supergiant Games arguably got popular for that exact reason, making new game after new game with Fire, Bash, and Transistor, and only making a sequel after Hades did extremely well. And I want to also be clear, I love sequels. I'm going to keep buying them, and this year alone there have been many announcements for sequels to games I'm excited for. I just don't like it when a sequel feels like cheap DLC to the first game, or like an entirely different product with the skin of the first game on it. So there's not really an answer or a conclusion to this topic, it's just something that's been on my mind for a while and I wanted to rant about it. As an indie dev myself, it's fun to think about what I'm gonna do if I have a game take off in the future. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I want to start making more content like this, so if you got to this point and you liked it, please leave a like, have a discussion in the comments if you want to keep it civil, and thanks so much for watching. Also, all the GDC talks and a little bit extra stuff I will have posted in the description. If you're interested, I highly recommend watching them. They're very good.